Hello, everyone that is here. Welcome to today's presentation on communication skills. So this is intended to provide you with an overview of what makes healthy and effective communication happen, as well as how we can build up our own communication abilities, both in individual lives and a little bit in our work lives, our professional lives. Before we get into it today, a little bit about me, who I am. My name is Sarah Groth. I am an LCPC and a CST, so a licensed clinical professional counselor in the state of Illinois, as well as a certified sex therapist through ASECT, the American Association of Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. A little bit of my background, specifically when it comes to communication. I work around communication from several different angles, I would say, many of which will come up in different ways throughout this presentation. As a therapist, as a clinician, I work with both individuals and couples or relationships. Couples therapy being one of the best spaces I feel like I've learned about communication through, both in teaching and observing it as much as I do. I also am our training coordinator here at Sage Therapy, meaning I facilitate workshops similar to this one, as well as guide professionals through creating and facilitating their own workshops. So communication on a little bit of that larger scale. Today's workshop will be broken down into 4 separate categories. We'll begin first by defining what effective communication at its very basics are, followed by understanding the roots of where we all learn to communicate. After getting a better understanding of what makes our communication styles, we'll go on to the second half where we will learn about new ways of communicating more effectively before taking some time to think about these skills, reflect on these skills, maybe practice these skills. Most of the lecture today will consist of me talking at you, sharing slides, but later on in the workshop, we'll have some activities to practice these communication skills, like I mentioned before, and just reflect on ourselves as communicators, how we learned to communicate, what stands in our way as communicators. I encourage having either a digital or physical place to write down thoughts, notes. Could just be a document on your computer, could be if you have paper notes in front of you, could be your phone, whatever works for you, just because we have a few activities where there's a bit of reflection encouraged. So we're going to begin by first identifying what good communication looks like and what gets in the way. So we'll start off by reviewing the very, very basics of what makes communication. Communication at its core is a simple linear process where the sender, the person wishing to communicate a specific message, codes a message in order to deliver it to the receiver, who decodes the message. It's the sender's job to clearly illustrate what they are wishing to share, and it's the receiver's job to make sense of what was just said to them. Effective communication occurs when the coding and decoding match up perfectly, meaning the intended message from the sender is understood completely by the receiver. It's our ideal gold star standard for communication. However, as we can all imagine and have witnessed many times, I'm sure, there are many ways in which the effectiveness of that communication can be disrupted. So, for example, say the sender wants to invite the receiver to lunch. The sender communicates the idea through the message, do you want to get lunch together? The receiver understands the sender is asking them to eat lunch together. They decide to go. Perfect, easy communication, linear process. However, the most common error is the sender error, in which the original message is coded in a way that is not clear, concise, or maybe the language isn't appropriate for the intended audience. If the message is coded improperly, the receiver will struggle to accurately decode the message. Sender errors may occur also when someone is too vague. So say a sender is inviting the receiver, that previous example, to lunch, and they're not specific enough in their message. Instead of asking if the person wants to get lunch, maybe they just say, hey, do you want food? The receiver may say yes, but might assume that the person is maybe just asking them like, hey, I have food. Do you want a snack? Do you want this? As opposed to inviting them to go sit down and eat lunch together. It's also common that the receiver does not properly decode the message, this other form of an encoding error. Inaccurate decoding can be caused by a number of factors. Maybe they're not actively listening to the sender. Maybe the person doesn't have the background knowledge or skills to decode a certain message. Or maybe they are allowing their own biases or perspectives to add meaning or take away meaning from the intended message from the sender. So say the sender asks, again, this simple question, do you want to get lunch together? But the receiver is not actively listening to them and doesn't catch all the words, assuming the sender asks, can you go get lunch? The receiver then goes on to assume the sender is requesting the receiver to go pick up lunch for both of them rather than enjoy lunch together. So it would be great if miscommunication were as easy and simple as those previous slides, to the point where we could just clearly point out the sender mistake, the receiver mistake, but usually it's more complicated than that. In most cases, there is responsibility on both sides when an error in communication happens. It's rarely a situation where only sender or receiver are fully at fault. Usually there's something to be shared in the process. And while this process seems pretty simple and was made pretty simple, drawn out with lines and emojis, it becomes far more complicated by the different ways we have all been socialized to communicate and listen to others. So let's dig into some of those ways. Let's look at some of the roots of communication, where we learn, and how we learn to communicate with others. So our first experiences with communication tend to be in our families of origin. From the beginning, family members help teach us how to communicate, both by teaching us our first verbal language, as well as nonverbal communication styles, such as our parents giving us a bottle of milk when we cry as a baby, showing us that when we alert them with this kind of sound, then they can resolve it. Attachment styles are first established with our parental relationships or close guardians, whoever is the adult present when we're very little. We learn how much we can depend on those that take care of us, including how effective communication is on getting our needs met. Children learn most through mimicking the behaviors they witness from older people. We call this phenomenon social learning, and most of our communication skills develop from what we see as opposed to what we are told. Seen a couple messages in the chat. Oh, yeah, no worries. For example, when we're coming back to this idea of social learning, this is a lot of times what we're taught more in sense of what we're observing as opposed to what we're outright told by a parent. So a great example of this, and honestly a personal example of this, you may come from a household where you were told, hey, it's impolite to interrupt people, it's impolite to jump over other people's words. And also, you may have been from a very loud and I come from a Jewish household where there was a bit of a norm of people kind of talking when they talk, which is a lovely experience and sometimes something I had to unlearn in professional settings or other social settings of, I know it's impolite, and sometimes there's that urge of, I'm excited to talk, I'm about to interject. With school and peers being probably like the next place the average person tends to learn communication once they're first stepping away from that family of origin or stepping to other arenas. So where our families teach us the basics of how language works, schools where we gain a more formal understanding, be it in our primary language or maybe the primary language around us. We also have a lot of space to practice communication in a very structured environment when we talk in class, be it in when there's formal discussions being held, or just like the social norms that we're taught, such as raising our hands to speak, raising our hands to ask to go out of the room, to approach the pencil sharpener, whatever else. Our friend relationships tend to also be the first relationships where we get to actively choose who we connect to, when we connect with them, where our family relationships tend to be a given. You're going to wake up every morning and your parents will be there, or your sibling will be there, or whomever else is in the household. We do have to actively work to seek out friends and maintain those connections. With that comes active practice in conflict resolution as well. Young children may not have a lot to say when it comes to conflict resolution at home, but when conflicts naturally arise with friends and other peers, we get to kind of make decisions for ourselves of how we want to go through that conflict or when we want to bring in other people for like adults for assistance. And then kind of in the background of all of this is our culture and the communities we belong to. While there are many communication basics that span across settings, across cultures, a lot is dictated by where we're at, who we're talking to at any given time. It may not be impolite to curse when you're talking with friends, but swearing in a business meeting, for example, with a stranger, will probably hurt your image. Social norms can be impacted by larger cultural settings. Perhaps you live in a country where prolonged eye contact is considered impolite, or where family members greet one another with kisses on the cheeks, and that's the norm. They can also be impacted by subcultures or maybe smaller communities where members may have to code switch between the communication style they use with different settings or people. Our identities also impact the roles and behaviors expected of us. Stereotypes and biases may lead people to believe we should act specific ways, and sometimes our own internalized biases can impact our behavior, and therefore our communication styles when one of our identities is highlighted. And a common example of this is, say, a woman enters a business meeting and she becomes very aware that she is the only woman in the room. She might feel uncomfortable then being too assertive in her communication, as this is often deemed to be a masculine trait in our culture that women should not have. So there would be that woman identity really being highlighted for her in that moment. All cultures, as well as individuals, have values they generally adhere to that can vary from other groups. Some cultures value individualism, and they may place very high value on appearing confident and standing out in communication, while other cultures may value more of that collectivist and group identity, and their value may be more so on someone who can blend in, be a team player in their communication style. So looking more at what these things teach us, our exposure to those around us have a strong influence on how we engage with language, our nonverbal communication style, how direct and clear we speak, our abilities to manage conflict, as I mentioned before, our comfort, our values, biases. We may not usually be thinking consciously about how our parents or our early, oh, sounds like someone just spoke a little bit. Just a little bit of pop-up. So yeah, coming back to our early experiences, it's hard to deny the influence of all these factors we just talked about. So for example, you may have grown up in a household where conflict was avoided by your parents, which may lead to less skill as an adult in conflict management. Or maybe you attended a school where you were taught it was critical to sit still to show others you are listening. So you may assume that that coworker who taps their foot a lot is not listening to you when you talk to them. Early experiences may also contribute to some of the barriers we experience around communication, such as the development of defense mechanisms, poor listening skills, emotional barriers, and some subjects being taboo, linguistic differences, those encoding and decoding errors, and just low trust in others. When we look more at each of these barriers, defense mechanisms refer to these automatic strategies to avoid conflict with others or within ourselves. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. There's a lot to get into with that piece. Emotional barriers and taboo subjects. Trying to avoid acknowledging our emotions can hurt our ability to clearly communicate our needs. Taboo subjects can be either culturally bound, like I mentioned before, or it could be specific to an individual, often including topics seemed to be sensitive for one reason or another, but usually not with a clear rule against talking about it. So maybe a common example of a taboo I often hear people talk about, my clients talk about, is in the workplace. There's nothing outright saying you can't talk about your salary in a lot of cases, but it is deemed this taboo, this sensitive subject, this inappropriate subject. And then this last barrier, linguistic difference, or one of these last barriers, linguistic differences. This could be in case of folks who don't share a primary language, or even those who might be speaking different dialects of the same primary language. Word connotations and slang may make it difficult to understand one's meaning, what they're trying to communicate. Encoding and decoding errors, that gets to kind of what we talked about in the beginning of, is the receiver receiving the information? Is the sender properly communicating what they mean? And low trust in others. This can come back to those themes around attachment, those themes around what did I learn about how to communicate from others? Were my parents very direct with me when we spoke? Or did it feel like I had to decipher the information? Did it feel like I couldn't trust what my friends were saying, what my teachers were saying as I was growing up? I mentioned before this idea of defense mechanisms, and we won't go super into this. This alone can be its own presentation, but a little bit about defense mechanisms, how they impact our communication. First off, why do we form these? Most of the time, we develop these strategies because at one point they did serve us. Maybe when we were younger, it was easier to block out difficult information in order to protect ourselves. Defense mechanisms are usually effective at alleviating distress, but this does come at the cost of effectively communicating with others and understanding our own larger needs. So a little bit on each of them. Denial, this refers to blocking out or ignoring information. This is usually purposeful as a means of protecting ourselves. So it can be as simple as avoiding reading an email from a supervisor when you're anticipating negative feedback. Denial, it's not there, I'm not thinking about it. Intellectualization is removing emotional reactions only to focus on the facts or logic of a situation. This may look like if you are apartment hunting, you may only focus on the logistics, like the cost, the size, rather than, oh, do I like the place where it's at? Do I feel homey here? Does this feel like a neighborhood where I could see myself living? Repression refers to unconsciously hiding painful thoughts or memories, similar to denial, but I highlight the difference here of repression is usually an unconscious thing we do, where denial is I know I see that email and I'm not going to read it just yet. So repression may look like not talking about a family member who you may be grieving, of just naturally your brain trying to think about other subjects, trying to focus on the good or what's going well. Displacement refers to directing strong emotions you're feeling in response to one situation towards another, unrelated person, thing, situation. So an example of this may be after getting harshly criticized at work by a colleague, you come home and you snap at your partner about what you're having for dinner. Your partner didn't do anything wrong in that situation, but it's that natural, I have these big emotions being displaced on you. Sometimes confused with projection, which is placing your own reactions or perspectives on another. Sounds like displacement at first, but the difference is not that you're lashing out at another person, but rather this projection is assuming the thoughts of another person. So this example might be you meet a new coworker and you don't like them. You don't get along, something doesn't click. But when someone else asks you, maybe a third party, why you're avoiding that person, you say, oh, person B, they don't like me. This person doesn't like me. So assuming, projecting those feelings onto another. Next, we have reaction formation. This is acting in a way different from how we truly feel about a situation. So when you're disappointed after doing poorly on a job interview, you say it after the fact that, you know what, I didn't really want that job to begin with. I'm having that feeling of this wasn't the right one. I wasn't that interested in anyway, even if you were really interested to start. Then our last two, rationalization. This is creating your own rationale for disappointing or undesirable outcomes. Maybe you fail a test and then you rationalize it as the test was too hard on the study guide was misleading. This was something outside my control, as opposed to dealing with the harsh reality of you didn't pass and you have to retake the test. And then regression, this is reacting to a situation through behaviors of an earlier developmental stage or how you used to act. This is one of those where thinking back to, again, those early attachment, those early communication styles can be really helpful because you're aware of okay, this is a younger version of me acting out in this moment. Example, you may be arguing with a family member, and because it's this family member, because it's priming that information of that younger version of you, you may react in ways you don't typically anymore, but you did when you were a teenager. Maybe you get in a fight with your mother and you slam the door because when you were 16 and you fought with your mother, door slamming was the norm for you. So now that we understand a little bit of where these things come from, where communication and communication barriers come from, now we're going to jump into the actual skills we can employ to become better communicators. So some starting points, some starting things to focus on now that we have this background is kind of these four things I like to start with. Um, First off, awareness, considering some of the important contextual factors going into communication. So asking yourself some of these basic questions that I think we used to ask when you'd like write essays when you were a child, when you did presentations in not grad school, in like high school, middle school, or maybe grad school. Who is your audience? Who are you trying to talk to? What's the environment in which you're approaching them? How do you feel about what you need to say to them? So I imagine with questions like these, if you were approaching a sibling at a holiday party to offer them a drink, it's going to be a different kind of communication than if you were going to approach your boss to ask for a raise. And it's good that that's different. That's normal, that's healthy, that's helpful. Being able to see, especially if while I say that, you can think of the, okay, yeah, this is how I'd approach it differently. That's a good awareness of context. Next off, when you're aware of the context, aware of what's happening, think next about your goals. What message do you want your audience to take away from you? This can be worth writing down or reflecting on for heavier conversations where there might be a lot of feelings involved. I often talk with clients that are approaching a difficult conversation about working backwards, starting with what do I want my takeaway to be? What do I want this person to get out of this conversation? And we can't always guarantee that, but by working backwards, we can try to start with the goal and then see, okay, how can I get to that point? What makes sense to kind of funnel to that point? And with your approach, you want to be direct and concise in your language. Thinking back to the sender and receiver illustration earlier, asking someone, would you maybe perhaps want to at some point get a little bit of food to eat during the workday versus do you want to have lunch together? Makes a huge difference. Being direct, concise makes us more understandable, especially when there may be language barriers or differences in dialect. This is also important when you look back to your context. Tailoring your approach and language to your audience. Again, you can talk to your sibling casually and maybe use more of those filler words, those maybes, those those but if you're talking to your boss and you're wanting to have that attitude of confidence, being more concise can really portray that. And then the last of some of these basic themes is feedback. Be open to and ask for feedback, not just in the ways to learn how to get better at communication, but I also mean this in ways that we can stop a miscommunication at the source or as it's happening, just by regularly when you're talking with someone, checking in of, did what I just say make sense? Is this clear? What are you understanding from what I'm saying? Those moments of checking in, getting what they're saying or what they're hearing can correct a miscommunication as it's happening. So what about conflict? Conflict does happen at some point or another. Work, home, with your friends, with your family, your coworker, the client on the phone, whoever. Even the best communicators will face conflict at one point. The point is not to avoid conflict, but to know how to do conflict right or as correctly as we can. On this one, we do take a huge page of the book of couples therapists. Again, bringing in the fact that I am a couples therapist, John Gottman. He's a psychotherapist, researcher, author of some of the best-selling books on preserving marriages, and is one of the experts in the field on successful conflict and communication. While his work, of course, focuses on on conflicts in the context of marriage, we find that a lot of these principles he and his fellow expert and spouse, Julie Gottman, introduced to us can help in all sorts of communication. One of the easiest ones to predict satisfaction in a marriage, and I would heavily argue other relationships as well, is what we call the four horsemen. The four horsemen describe these four strongest predictors of marital dissatisfaction, and in our case, predictors of negative communication experiences. They include criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. Taking these one by one, criticism refers to attacking a person's character. It goes beyond simply giving a person negative feedback by telling them that there's something wrong about them. So an example of this would be like, you didn't finish your assignment, you're so lazy, you're being lazy right now. Contempt can be very similar to criticism, but it often goes a step further. It's seeing a person as either beneath you or directly showing them disrespect beyond just a critical comment. Where criticism may be calling someone lazy, contempt takes it a step further of you're awful to work with because you're so lazy. Defensiveness takes a step away from going on the attack to try and preserve our own characters when we feel threatened in a communication situation. It's avoiding taking responsibility for our own part in conflict and miscommunication. So maybe it sounds like, well, I never told you that. I had to remind you. I was doing my part. I wasn't doing blah, blah, blah. Stonewalling can sometimes be one of the most challenging of the four to address. In this context, stonewalling refers specifically to someone disengaging from a conversation when they feel emotionally overwhelmed. It may look like someone completely going silent. It may be someone literally walking away or trying to find that out. Or it's a person passively responding with the intent of just ending a conversation. You may see this in a person repeatedly just saying, yep, yes, yes, you're right, without saying much else at the end of the argument. So now that we know these big four horsemen, it's also helpful to know that each of them has their own antidote, and it can be really difficult to actually stop them without knowing the antidote. Luckily, each of them has these corresponding pieces that, whether they're occurring or not, can be really helpful to employ to reduce conflict, end conflict, to resolve conflict, whatever else. Criticism can be prevented with the use of what we call gentle startups. Gentle startup is exactly what it sounds like, utilizing a softer approach when talking with the other person, especially when first confronting that person. There are a lot of components that can soften your startup. One of the most critical ones being the use of something some of us may be familiar with, I statements, which are statements that we use that center ourselves as opposed to the other person. They use phrases like, I feel blank because blank, or I need blank, I am feeling blank. When we speak about our own feelings or wants, we're far less likely to put the blame on other people. And that's more of the critical thing here. It's not so much as saying like, oh, I feel really frustrated that you're so blah, 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 as much as I feel frustrated because this is happening, because I'm having this reaction, because I'm witnessing this thing, really making ourselves the center of that point. So another example may be, as opposed to saying something like, you're being so frustrating, the statement, I feel so frustrated. There is a subtle difference, but definitely one I'd encourage reflecting on. A gentle startup must also include speaking objectively to the best of your ability. A great way to approach this is to give a basic recap of what happens, i.e. what you're approaching this person for, that just states the facts. Alongside it, when making a request, making sure you're making positive requests, asking for them to do something differently as opposed to, hey, just stop doing that thing. So bringing this all together, that may sound like, in our meeting last week, we discussed you finishing the assignment on Tuesday. It's Thursday now. I feel concerned about this assignment being late. Can you tell me where you're at in completing it? Brought together, all these components of a gentle startup prevent it from becoming overly blaming or aggressive. Contempt is addressed by fostering a culture of appreciation and respect. This goes along with solutions we just spoke about in gentle startups and avoiding blame when we approach others, but also it necessitates active engagement when conflict isn't happening. Avoid using language that puts down others, even in moments where you think you're being playful or joking. Making active efforts to express gratitude regularly for things that are big or things that are small. Of, hey, thank you for sending me this memo. When it comes to defensiveness, the best way to challenge it is to be able to take ownership in our role in conflict. So that's not to say that you have to claim sole responsibility whenever a conflict occurs. In fact, you don't have to believe that you are 50% responsible for conflict. But the fact of the matter is, in almost every conflict situation, almost in every fight, we have played some role in making it worse and contributing to it and it starting. Even if we didn't cause the original event to occur, we often don't show up as our best selves in responding to it. We're all human. So for example, say you're fighting with your partner about not doing the dishes. Classic. Maybe it was your partner's night to do dishes and they didn't. But if you noticed the dishes not being done and stayed quiet about it, even as you got annoyed, you had a role to play in that conflict. In a situation like that, you can take ownership by making a statement like, I didn't speak up when I noticed the dishes weren't washed. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner that I was feeling that upset. For the last horseman, stonewalling, one of the best strategies we know is knowing when to take a time out. When we stonewall, it's usually due to the fact that we have become so flooded, meaning emotionally overwhelmed. Sometimes people think of it as like going into that fight or flight mode, that we can no longer engage effectively in our communication skills. Usually, this isn't just in our head. It's because our heart rate is going through the roof and our body itself is reacting to this stressful situation. When we're reacting physically like this, we will not be at our best self emotionally. That is why it can be critical to take a pause so that we can get back to homeostasis, so we can get back to our baseline before returning to the conversation. Of course, the conversation does need to be returned to. Sometimes this is another piece I have to explain to partners that it's not just a, hey, we're stopping and we're benching that conversation. The Gottman rule of thumb with this is generally that a pause should take at least 30 minutes for people to fully get back to baseline, but should be no more than 24 hours. Maybe you and a colleague have a heated discussion and it's good to take an hour break, but don't take a week break for sure. Take your time to self-soothe, come back to the conversation with a fresh mind, being able to best approach the listening, the talking, the whatever else. Which, on the subject of listening, of course, speaking is only one half, if even that, of communication. Think back to the start of our conversation. A lot of miscommunication can be born out of sender or encoding errors, but there's always the risk for receiver or decoder error. To be a master at communication, you have to be a master at active listening. When we look at active listening, we can usually break these examples of it into two categories, the verbal components and the nonverbal components. So when you are receiving information, there are a lot of ways you can show your engagement through what you say in response. The most important skill you can have in active listening, a skill that can do wonders at preventing communication errors, is asking for clarification. If you think you might have heard the other person wrong, stop them, ask. You may also engage with follow-up questions to get more specifics or details around something you might either not fully understand or be curious to know more about. So when listening, you can also show your interest with smaller verbal cues you give. Thinking of when we're communicating and we use those, yeah, it makes sense. Those are those small things that show a person, I'm still here, I'm hearing you, I'm listening. Reflection of the speaker's meaning can also be important, of having these moments of, wow, it sounds like this was a really frustrating situation, or I'm hearing that we're going to call him, but with the meeting that came up at work, you weren't able to. Does that sound right? Being able to summarize also what you're hearing from them. And then waiting until the speaker is finished to speak, to respond. Makes sense, sounds basic in theory, but I know there's probably situations where all of us are hearing another person and we're already thinking about our rebuttal. We're already thinking, this is what I'm going to say next. This is what I want to say when they're done speaking, even if we don't cut them off. And that can be a hard trait to break, but a really important one to make sure I am getting every piece. I'm listening to every piece, giving myself a moment, and then responding to them. Nonverbal parts of active listening might sound pretty straightforward as well, but a lot of us may struggle with these components more than we realize. When you're able to, one of the clearest signs to show someone that you are listening to them is to make eye contact with them. Now, of course, there may be situations where eye contact can be difficult to maintain. Sometimes it has to do with neurodiversity, or even cultural differences might impact one's comfort level or just norms with eye contact. It can be a helpful skill to hone, but it may not always be accessible, which is why you should also remember other ways that you're showing you're engaged. So are you facing towards the speaker? Are your shoulders facing towards them? Are you physically sitting in the direction of them? Or are you still facing your computer, facing your desk, whatever else? Not trying to split your focus between something else and the speaker. I know we live in an era where most of us have our phones on our desk near us, or we may be typing still, or there's so many emails to respond to. But it being so critical if we want to be good communicators to understand that as humans, we're not that good at multitasking, or at least not as good as we think we are. Engaging with body language or having engaged body language. Again, are you facing the person? Are you shoulder level with them? Are you slunched over? Are you actually facing a different direction? That shows a lot about engagement in these subtle ways. And focusing on understanding before considering your reply. Similar to that waiting till the speaker is done speaking, making sure before you reply, do I understand what they're saying to me? Am I getting what they're saying? This can be a perfect place to bring back in that reflection. So in getting to our first reflection, our first activity for today, this will be a pretty short one, but we will watch a couple brief clips of a couple talking in different contexts. And with this, we're going to kind of pay attention to how are they showing up as active listeners? Are they being active listeners? What is their words, their body language, their tone, the way that respond to each other say about how they're actively listening? So this is a place of coming back to, if you have like digital document, your phone, paper, whatever else, writing down your observations. Could be full sentences, totally fine if it's just bullet points, single words, totally fine there. Both of these clips come from the show The Good Place, if you're familiar, showing a couple, Eleanor and Chidi, if you've seen the show, at different points in time. If you haven't seen the show, don't worry. The context may not make a lot of sense. We're not focused on the context. This is okay. The goal of this, again, is just to pay attention to how they listen, or at times don't listen to each other. You'll see in the first clip, there will be this moment where there's clear conflict happening, where in the second scene, it's far more about a moment of reassurance. That being said, even in the second clip, you may see moments where communication and listening could have been improved. So feel free to look critically at both moments, not just a, oh, this is the bad one and this is the good one. And also a heads up, I imagine this won't be too much of a shocker for many, but there may be some PG-13 language in the second clip. So there are some moments of sexual humor, just as a heads up. Starting with our first clip.
We hope you enjoy your eternal stay in the good place. Take advantage of our day spa, or Janet, a magical assistant who can get you whatever you want. And if
You might turn that off. It's been playing on a loop for 2 days.
The whole neighborhood is offline. We only get the welcome channel. I would love to not watch TV, but you canceled school. What have you done to me, you monster? Look at all these dishes piling up. I used to just throw them in the sink and they'd be magically cleaned by morning.
I did that. I cleaned the dishes.
Oh, then what's up with these bad boys?
You are Unbelievable.
Are you still upset? You're not over it yet?
How can I be over it? We haven't discussed it or even spoken for days.
Well, it sounds like you've had a really nice vacation from your full-time job. Get your story straight, bro.
Hey guys, it's Michael.
Hi, Michael. What a lovely
Sit there.
surprise.
Just again, a little brief clip. Is everyone able to hear it okay? The speaking, okay, I see a thumbs up.
Oh,
We hope you
Next one.
Oh no, I knew it. You hate me now. What did it? That time I was subpoenaed by the Make-A-Wish Foundation?
no.
Oh, I knew what it was. In my defense, I didn't realize he was my boyfriend's twin until halfway into hooking up with him. And at that point, it's a sunk cost.
I don't hate you at all. I mean, you were dealt a pretty tough hand. You essentially had to raise yourself, but you were still more confident and self-possessed at 13 than I ever was. I mean, seeing your whole life all laid out like this, it's remarkable.
Okay, so you still love me. You're still horny for me, blah, blah, blah. Then what's wrong?
I'm not good enough for you. I mean, look at my file. It is 1/10 as long as yours because I did nothing with my life.
Yeah, we're very different, but we already knew that. Why are you freaking out? You're cool, confident Cheaty now, remember?
I am confident about my feelings for you. I am also confident that I am a damn drip and you deserve to be with someone who's not. Like Nicholas, the fireman that you dated back in 2009. He rescued people from burning buildings and he was so hot.
Oh, Nicholas the fireman. Nicholas. I can't argue with you on that one, but I love you. There is no one else I want to be with. At least not forever. I mean, if Frida Kahlo wants to make out with me in heaven, then you and I are going to have a conversation. But if you read my file and you're good, then we're good. Unless there's something in your file that would freak me out, like you kept out a library book past the due date.
But I moved and it got buried in the bottom of a box. I put the library in my will to make up
No,
for
I'm
it.
kidding. I'm kidding. Relax. Let's go back to work.
That is the second one.
Oh no, I knew it.
So coming back to, yeah, any thoughts y'all had with that? I know there's a good amount of us now and can't fully get into it, but if there are any reactions, any things that were noticed specifically, if people want to share in the chat. I know I can speak to, especially like the first one, some examples just off the bat around like body language of first chunk, they weren't even like facing each other. They were still in separate rooms of their house, which definitely isn't something I would recommend by any means when it comes to active listening, to being an active listener. Anything else that we may be noticing from those clips? Yeah, definitely differences in tone. Yeah, I see that. Of even just in like, you can see the aggressiveness in some of the tone in the first one where there was a quick of needing to respond snappy, needing to be on that offensive, defensive. Yeah, definitely improvements in the body language in the second one of seeing them, there being the importance of sitting together, facing each other. So in my first clip, I noticed that as they moved closer towards one another, the body language shifted and the eye contact facing, even though, yeah, there was sarcasm, aggressive tone in the voice. Yeah, definitely that noticing that difference. And I think that's something maybe we didn't even speak, or I didn't even speak to as much before, but proximity being this huge thing. And again, proximity can also be something very culturally bound. You will notice if you travel across the world, in some places being directly face to face is normal and friendly, and in some places that means you're about to start a fight. So that can be super culturally bound, but proximity can also be an indicator. Yeah, can move on to this last section just to make sure we have time, but of course definitely encourage the continued reflection, continued takeaways there. So communication at work, just a brief bit, just looking at communication specifically in the workplace. I know for a lot of us, that's what we're looking for here. We're looking at, yes, I know how to talk with my partner, I know how to talk with my family, but work is work. So it's easy to note places where effective communication is integral in our personal lives, like I said, but we may not always remember the benefits of these communication skills in our professional lives. We know that effective communication in the workplace can lead to increased job satisfaction and even higher rates of retention of employees, especially if you are someone coming to us from a higher management place or middle management place. Other benefits can include increased communication. Other benefits of increased communication can include decreased conflict between colleagues, higher productivity, forming stronger relationships, and being able to utilize resources properly. It's important to note as well that when we look at professional settings, they come with their own unique barriers to communication. These include both environmental and personal barriers. So when we look at environmental barriers, there's of course something to be said about time, whether it's literally the amount of hours you have in the day to do tasks or knowing that there can be strict deadlines. I know something that comes up in the industry I'm in as a therapist is it would be great if we could all just do our notes when we get to them and do billing when we get to it, but there is often this pressure of meeting deadlines, making sure notes are done in time, making sure all T's are crossed and I's are dotted. Workplace culture and power dynamics, the norms that are set between coworkers, especially between manager and subordinates, can dictate a lot of how communication is handled. If higher ups are creating a culture where authority is not to be questioned, those working under them will feel unable to communicate their needs and ask for clarification effectively. And terminology and misunderstanding. All work settings have their own dialects, specific words, phrases that are more common to their settings than others. Sometimes if people are coming from different professional backgrounds, say an accountant is trying to talk to a salesperson, they may not completely understand the terminology that one another uses, and that can really get in the way of the effectiveness. And then when it comes to personal barriers, a lot of these connect back to things we talked about before of beliefs, values, biases. What are the values you come in with from your personal life? Because that will show up in your work life in one way or another. Fears about disrupting the status quo. This kind of connects back to that idea of taboos we talked about before, but also just maybe there's a fear of I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want to draw too much attention. I'm afraid of if I do something different, then maybe I'll be criticized for it. Maybe I'll get negative feedback, especially from a higher up. There can also be a lack of empathy. And when I mention empathy here, it's not to say that most people in a workplace setting are not empathetic. It's to say that when we're stressed at work, when we may not be working those empathy muscles, it can be really hard to empathize with others. So an example of that, if you're anxiously waiting for your supervisor to provide you with feedback on a document that you need to submit, you're probably not going to be understanding to the same degree with them about the fact that they have a few different supervisees to provide feedback to and may not be able to get back to your work immediately or as soon as you may expect them to. So when we talk about these barriers, a little bit of thoughts of overcoming. And again, splitting these in these kinds of forms of the environmental versus the personal. So environmental, some of this may be out of our control, of course, but looking at managerial philosophies that value open communication, if you are someone with people under you, what are your values as a manager? What are your values at work? And one, how do you embody them? And two, are you embodying them? Are you creating a space for open communication if that's something that you believe in and you value? Decreasing links in communication to prevent distortion. What I mean by this is a lot of times there can be a lot of middlemen in conversations of one person says to this person, says to that person. And I think many of us at one point, especially if you grew up in a Western school system, have played the telephone game. And we know that in the telephone game, things get lost, things get taken apart, things get miscommunicated. So the more that we can be direct of person A talking to person B, which may not always be fully possible, but that's another great way of incorporating technology. And like, are you CCing other people in communication? Are you forwarding original messages? Are you having meetings with more than one person on the call, so it doesn't have to go through so many different links. Allowing enough time for communication as well. Again, time can be a tricky one because we can't always make more of it, but are you emailing a coworker a day before something is due, or are you emailing them a week before something is due? Again, it's a small thing, it's a little thing that can be easy to get lost, but can be really important. And a theme that's come up in multiple ways throughout today, checking in between sender and receiver regarding understanding. Did that make sense? What were your takeaways from our meeting today? Is there anything I could clarify from our meeting today? And then the personal, reflect on one's own values and how they present at work, similar to the managerial, but this could be regardless of where you stand, regardless of where you're at in the levels of your workplace. Thinking about what's important to me about my work life, what's important to me about my balance between work and home and all of these other things. Familiarize yourself and others with resources available. Learn about your HR department, learn about what's available there. And again, even if this isn't work specific, maybe you're coming from an academic setting. Do you know about what's there for you? Do you know about things that you can use to advocate for yourself in that setting? Practice active listening with others, of course, something we just talked about, but really trying to be cognizant of, am I doing these things? Am I showing up actively in conversation? And in the same note, consider the perspectives of others. Do I understand where this person is coming from? Do I understand what this other person does in the workplace? Or am I just frustrated because it feels like our jobs don't line up? So these are just an overview. Of course, there could be other things that come up as potential ways to overcome barriers, but just to have a place to start thinking. Which then brings us to a bit of our second and last reflection, which is a bit of a wrap-up kind of reflection as well. So for this, there will be two parts to this question. One part we'll spend maybe a little bit on and then add in the second. So this first question I want you to think about, to write down, and this is solely a personal reflection. Don't need to share this in the chat or anything. What is a barrier I currently face in communication? So this may be at work, like we just talked about, or perhaps it's a barrier in your family, your friend group, your dating relationship. What is a barrier I currently face in communication? So take about 30 seconds or so, first thing that comes into your head. Now it's okay if you're still thinking on that first part. It's okay if you're still adding thoughts there, but to add in the second part, how can I address this barrier? So this can be thinking about stuff we talked about earlier in the workshop, especially what we discussed in section 3 of different ways of approaching either listening or speaking. You may even come up with strategy that we didn't even discuss today, but maybe got primed by conversation today. Either way, write down your idea. Again, it doesn't have to be full sentences, can be bullet points, can be single phrases, single words. Write that down, keep it somewhere. Take another minute or two just to think on this. All right. And again, if you're still thinking, you're still sitting with that, totally fine. Definitely a question I'd even encourage continuing to sit with after this. But I want to thank you all for coming up, participating in today's workshop. This brings us to the end of the discussion. That last thought, just to take away from it. I hope that you can take either that last activity or other things we've spoken about today with you into future interactions, maybe interactions later today, whether at work, home, wherever. If you're interested in learning more about Sage Therapy, about what we have to offer, you can check out our websites. So there's two websites on the screen. One is sagetherapy.com. This is our general main landing page where you can learn about the services we offer, look at our therapist profiles, dive through the resources we have available to clients, clinicians alike, or if you're interested in learning more about additional services we offer. We also have sagetherapytraining.com. This is where we host our on-demand trainings. This is a website that includes both continuing education units and non-continuing education trainings on a variety of topics that you can access at your convenience. And if you have any questions about our trainings, feel free to reach out to us at training@sagetherapy.com or visit either of those websites. Again, thank you all for joining us for today's workshop. I look forward to seeing you all in the future, and I hope you all have a happy weekend.